but technology isn't neutral. It's always shaped and designed and fashioned by people.
Hello everyone, my name is Stephen Parton and you are listening to the Feedback Loop on Singularity Radio. This week our guest is author and podcaster Azeem Azhar, who has a robust background as an investor, a founder, and a regulator in the tech space, which includes several years working with the World Economic Forum on the Global Future Council on Digital Economy and Society. Azeem spends much of his time these days creating content for his blog Exponential View, where he provides weekly assessments of the dynamics that are at play in humanity's exponential transformation. The key ideas he's uncovered on this journey can be found in his latest book, The Exponential Age: How Accelerating Technology is Transforming Business, Politics, and Society. In this episode, we review his book and the wisdom that he's gained over the years, with a particular emphasis on the impacts of the growing divide that is taking place between technology's advancements and society's ability to keep up with those advancements. And with that being said, let's jump into it. Everyone, please welcome to the Feedback Loop, Azeem Azhar. So about a year ago, you released The Exponential Age: How Accelerating Technology is Transforming Business, Politics, and Society. So that seems like a pretty natural place to start. So I'd love if you could just kind of tell us a bit about the motivation for that book.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's great to be on the show, and with an audience that sort of understands accelerating technology. I'm going to guess. Yeah, I think the real motivation was that as I started to spend time, having exited my last startup about 7 years ago, there was definitely a sort of a distinct shift in the nature of the technologies that we were seeing. So on the one hand, we were in the midst of this the start of the AI boom that had kicked off about 2011, 2012 with these various breakthroughs in deep neural networks. But you were also starting to see within clean tech that things like solar power and battery technology was getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And the heart of any, what makes a technology exponential when we talk about it is, as an economist, is actually this idea that it's getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So when you draw that graph, that sort of the exponential curve, what's fundamentally embedded in that is that you're getting more power for the same price, right? Your price performance is going up, and that's essentially what's happened in semiconductors. When you bought a transistor, which is like the fundamental unit of a traditional computer chip, in 1958, 1960, it would cost like $120, $120 then, $1,200 in 2020 terms. Transistors today cost fractions of a hundredth of a millionth of a dollar. It's so cheap, it's actually really hard to say. So exponential technologies are not actually just about power increasing, it's about price performance improving dramatically. And I started to see that in a few areas, computing as sort of demonstrated through AI, clean energy, and then also within the biological domain, and in additive manufacturing, that we were starting to see a whole host of these exponentials taking place, and that I think I wanted to make some sense of, like, why was it happening, and then critically, what does it actually mean? And I mentioned that I was sort of an economist by training, and economists often think in terms of institutions, and I certainly do for a bunch of family reasons that I sort of touch on in the book. And I started to think that a lot of the issues that we were facing in that period, 2016, 2017 onwards, seem to relate to the institutions in which we sort of surround ourselves, like defamation laws or monopoly laws, were struggling to contend with the questions that were being asked by these technologies. And so that's why I wanted to put out a book that combined both my explanation for why we were actually in the exponential age. It's a big claim to make about anything, and then start to say, well, what does this actually mean, and how does that help us explain the level of sort of friction and the possibility for transformation that these technologies will deliver? So that was the, in a sense, the motivation.
Yeah, and that friction you talk about there, would it be fair to say that that's the exponential gap that you talk about in the book, that distance between the advancing technology and society's capacity to keep up with it?
Yeah, that is the friction, right? So the friction is essentially that the technology advances, constructs new ways of behave, new types of behavior, new ways of manifesting itself, but the institutions that we use to guide our everyday lives are based on other assumptions, and that I call the exponential gap. The institutions are linear. Podcast listeners can't see this, but I'm holding my hand up like a straight line at sort of 20 degrees to the horizon. The technology is exponential, and I'm now making a terrible exponential curve with my hand, and that's the exponential gap. And it was just a way of analyzing and making sense of the fact that we seem to have all these issues around what's going to be the future of work, what's going to be the future of competitive markets, what's going to be the future of trade, what's going to be the future of political discourse. And I've been around for a while. I just turned 50, and I don't remember a time where so many things were up in the air. I mean, there were things that were existential that were up in the air. Like, we were worried about global nuclear war when I was 10 years old. And that's existential, but it's only one thing. Whereas today we were like, well, there's all these things, and it all seemed to point back to somehow Moore's law or something similar. And I was trying to make sense of all of that.
So as you wade into that chaos, what kind of mindset do you go into it with? How do you kind of separate yourself from the stress or the vertigo of such a disorienting environment and kind of ground yourself in a way that allows you to see clearly, to start understanding what's actually taking place?
I think that I'm really lucky just at my moment in time, because I got a computer when I was 9 years old, and I got my second computer when I was 12, and my third when I was 14. And my mum had a computer. In fact, she was the first person in the family to have one, and in that, I saw its capabilities improve constantly, and I was exposed to the idea of Moore's law probably by the time I was 12 or 13, so in a sense, that idea that the computers were going to get faster and cheaper and performance was going to improve was really, really embedded, in me, even if I couldn't make it explicit. And actually, kind of funnily enough, when I did my university finals in one of my economics papers, I had a complete mind blank. This is in 1994, on everything I'd ever studied. And there was one question, I forget what it was, and I thought I could just about squeeze talking about Intel and the 80286 chip and the 80386 chip and the 80486 chip, because that was the latest chip at the time. And I did, and I kind of made it up, and actually the examiners loved it, and I did quite well in that paper. So I think that part of the advantage that I and other people who've grown up in that period, when computing wasn't hidden by black Gorilla Glass, which it now is that we tinkered and we learnt and we understood these processes, and being that close to it, I think, gives you a sense of what's going on. When I then get into my career and I'm kind of constantly working on the internet, I've embedded this idea that stuff will get faster and cheaper. And if it's a bit shonky right now, like I used to listen to sort of Seattle and Portland electronica radio stations streamed over the internet, like 16 kilobits in 1995, you knew it was going to get better, and the quality would get better and better. And so that, I think, sets you up to understanding this, and you understand Moore's law, and I tracked Yahoo's user growth between 94 and 97, 98 for my job, and it looked like a hockey stick. And then, Ray Kurzweil comes out with a couple of his books, and his essay, which I think has really stood the test of time, The Law of Accelerating Returns, which he came out with in 2001, where he explains this. And I think at that point, it's really, really kind of embedded in me. So that's a long-winded way of saying that, I started with this deeply lived experience around this trend. I learned a little bit about Moore's law. Byte magazine, BYTE, which is no longer published, but I recommend listeners go off and look at archives on the internet. It's absolutely phenomenal from the 80s and early 90s on this, because it was discussed all the time. And I only really started to understand that it was a sort of separate thing that you could think about in terms of planning by, the mid to late 90s. And then, of course, the Kurzweil essay, and then starting to, realize that when I would do business modeling, I was often the models that I built were nonlinear, right? Because you knew they were nonlinear, right? That's how these systems grow, and so it was embedded in me for a while. What took a long time was to try to unpick why this is actually happening, and I don't think Ray explains it in that essay. The sort of the work that I did around why does this exponentiality actually happen, was I spent a long time thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, what could you maybe offer up an answer to that in this sense? Why is it happening? Like, I know that's a big question, but can you kind of hit some of the key points?
So I love the why, because the why for me is amazingly human in all of this, right? So just as a simple example, lockdowns happened, people are bored at home, we've all watched the end of Netflix and we've read to the end of Reddit. So what do? We make sourdough, and the first sourdough we make it takes ages, tastes like crap. I hope I can say crap in the podcast. There's mess all over the kitchen, you've wasted half of it and no one eats it. And the second loaf, there's less waste, you do a bit better. By the eighth loaf, it's kind of, there's not a crumb of flour wasted. The kitchen is immaculate and it tastes delicious. And we learnt by doing. And so what we discover is that in kind of complex engineered multi-step product processes, there are lots of things that you end up being able to improve. And that gives rise to a learning rate, a rate at which you learn how to do this better. And what determines your learning rate is what your mum used to tell you: practice makes perfect. It's doing more of it. And so this relationship of the learning curve was identified, sort of formalized, well, by mothers for thousands of years, but by Theodore Wright, who was an aeronautical engineer and attached to the US military. And in the mid-30s, he realized that there was this kind of learning curve that for every doubling of cumulative production of an airframe, it was 15% unit cost cheaper, because the engineers figured out how to do things better. And so that learning is really the relationship that actually underpins Moore's law. Moore's law is actually not as sort of it's a sort of social construct that the semiconductor industry has agreed to stick to or adhere to as best they can. But Wright's law, which is about learning rates, tells us about kind of got these complex products. So then the question is, well, when you've got a learning rate, what sorts of things might accelerate it? And there are a number of things that would accelerate it. So one is if you can expand the market faster, right? Because the learning is a function of cumulative demand, not of time. So if demand doubles every 10 years, learning will be much slower than if demand doubles every 10 minutes, right? And so things that you can do to extend and expand demand help a lot. And so the increasing architectural choices that were made around technology to make it more modular, so that things were not these big meaty stacks like the first mainframes, but were kind of componentized, meant that these components are simpler, optimizations are more kind of apparent as to where they need to be, and a modular component like a silicon chip that can work in everything from the computer of a farm through to the RAM and a camera expands the market. So your demand can increase really, really rapidly. The availability of those types of technical combinations means that new use cases emerge, which drive sort of novel knowledge foraging and discovery that might help people to better improve the product. And then having networks of information and trade and the finance that supports them gives you global access to markets, which increases demand, but it also speeds up the rates of learning. So what you end up with is, this kind of amazing bit of classical economics at work in semiconductors, where the lasers are built by the people who build the very, very best lasers. It's ASML in the Netherlands, but they're operated by the guys who absolutely operate those lasers better than anyone else, which is TSMC in Taiwan. And you're able to do that. So what happens is that the kind of clock speed takes off, but it's not just about somehow the inherence of the technology. Yes, the engineers are doing the hard work at the front end, but a global market, this kind of architectural modularity, all of these things are helping by driving the demand, and then with that accelerating the sort of the time-based aspect of the learning.
Yeah, and do you think things are only going to continue to streamline in that sense? Because I think the EU just passed a law, or is trying to pass a law in order to standardize chargers or ports or something on phones. I can't remember. I just recently saw a thing about it. But this is one of those things where you have like proprietary technologies between different companies that are making things less efficient. It's more difficult to do this innovation and to keep things efficient. And it feels like maybe the government and the market are kind of stepping in and saying, hey, let's honor Wright's law, let's honor this efficiency thing. And then there's just this market pressure to streamline and make things more efficient, so there's less hurdles in the way.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a really interesting question. I mean, the power charging thing is sort of fascinating, because I think it also reflects it reflects something about the power that emerges, like the political power that emerges in these markets. I think Apple was just in a really weird place, because actually the USB standard was running away from them anyway, and it was getting better than the Lightning standard in the iPhones. So it's not clear to me that they frankly lose very much from it. If not, they don't even gain. And I think of all the hills Apple could die on, the Lightning format is not plug format. Is not the one for them to really take their last stand. I think there is a question about whether this sort of fragmentation of the global economy and agreements might reduce the size of demand and might slow down learning. So I think that is not going to happen. I don't really talk about it in the book, but the reason I don't think it's going to happen is because there are new ways for us to learn. And some of those new ways to learn are coming through the technologies we've developed, right? So AI and virtual twinning constructs new ways to learn. So what's virtual twins is you basically simulate products that you want, and you do the learning by building like 1 million digital replicas and see how they perform in your virtual environment. And so actually you can speed up that optimization process to get to a better product. And I give an example actually in the book of that with a yacht. A yacht sort of hydrofoil. The other thing is that AI is turning out to be a real accelerator, because if you think about what is that process of learning that we're going through, it's about having these products, putting them into actual use, seeing how they get used, figuring out from experience what paths you could take that would be more efficient. Now, the thing that you can do within sort of machine learning or sort of high performance computing is that you can explore many of those paths almost in a sense virtually without building that. And I think one of the things that we've seen within AI is that the rate of acceleration, at least measured by complexity of AI models, is much faster than the Moore's law curve we've seen in the last 60 years. I think what you're going to be able to see is you're going to be able to use AI to enhance the rate with which learning can occur. And it's early days now to see whether it really will have that impact. But there's a sense in it for me that it might be able to do that. I think the second thing is just that these markets are now getting really big, and even in a fragmenting economy, these fragmented markets might be large. I mean, just think about what's happening with solar panels. And even beyond that, even in a kind of fragmenting economy, trade will continue to take place. And that trade will take place at not in the sort of unalloyed, unconstrained way that was imagined from the 1980s onwards, but it will still take place, and there will still be massive global markets for underlyings that go into the technology, even if like sort of sharp ends in certain areas can only address certain countries because of sanctions or restrictions. So I don't think from the kind of geoeconomics of this that the learning rates will slow down. I think that Ray Kurzweil's argument in the 2001 essay, which is that this idea of layered S curves that actually make the exponential is a quite a compelling one, and I actually didn't find any better explanation than that. And the idea simply there is that when you actually break down an exponential curve, what it is, it's there's a particular product enhancement in manufacturing that comes along. It's got the shape of an S curve. It's a bit rubbish at first. It then gets really, really useful, and then you flog it to death and it doesn't deliver anything. But by the time you get there, you found another optimization that's a different S curve that allows you to get up there. And he talks about it as a kind of empirical set of observations, and we can argue about whether that's a sort of robust enough theory, but I didn't find a better explanation than that. So I thought that's a useful one to use.
Yeah, and you touched on the politics there, which I think is really important. And one of the things that you've talked about in the book that this growing gap affects is something like political polarization. Can you maybe talk a bit about some of these specifics, like how this growing divide is affecting our political landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are two ways. So I'm going to be like a choose your own adventure, like an old school adventure. I'm going to give
Love
you
it.
two choices, and Stephen, and then you can decide which direction you want to go. Right. So one is the direction of how changes in general might can start to construct division, and the second would be, how do the platforms built on top of these technologies manifest themselves in ways that may be divisive? So there's your choice. Like, do you want to go left to the dark wood or right into the cave with only a sliver of light and the rumble of an angry monster?
I want to go for the angry monster, I think.
I don't know which of those two was the angry monster. Okay, so you tell me. You tell me.
Yeah,
Go.
let's talk about the companies and the structure, because I think that might actually include some of the human nature and the inevitable change aspects to it as well. So let's lean towards the latter.
Yeah, of course. So one of the things that this sort of exponential shift has done is it's put computing everywhere, and so we all have a digital persona that lives on social networks that we access 15, 16 hours a day, and on the other hand, you've got computing that can actually manage manage all of that for us. And so we find ourselves mediated by a platform, and as every product developer knows, you end up making choices. And so in the book, I talk about how the rapidity with which discourse appeared online and started to then become the dominant place where conversations about the world happened and where people learnt about the world, was extremely fast. To think that 15 years ago, not a single one of us discussed politics on Facebook, not even Mark Zuckerberg, right? Nobody did, because well, maybe not 15 years ago, 17 years ago, right? It's a blink of an eye. And so there are ultimately, we're then mediated in someone else's platform. And the platform owner has their own ultimately kind of commercial agenda about the choices that they do and don't make. And those choices are not transparent. And what they've done, what's happened in a really short period of time, is that they have constructed a new sort of common space, but it which we all think of as being a common space, but actually it's owned and controlled by them. And so we've seen over the years Facebook and Twitter and so on change the way that they handle bad behavior. They've changed the kind of information they show to us. Facebook used to just show a raw feed of reverse chronological information, and then that became too spammy and they started to rank it algorithmically, but we didn't know what they were ranking for. Of course, it's turned out and come out more explicitly since I wrote the book that a lot of the ranking they did was designed to get people to engage, and the best way to do that was to make them outraged. So there was that dynamic, but there's also another dynamic, which is the fact that our private space, things that we think of as private, was starting to seem private, but avail itself to these corporations, right? And so they were the ones who were starting to mediate and see and access the relationships that we have, and it's really, really powerful. My previous company startup was called Peer Index, and we initially what we wanted to do was build a kind of common layer across all social networks, so you could manage your identity across all of them. And when we would do our experiments and we would look at the academic research, it's when you can put the entire graph of relationships of people into a modern data structure, the inferences you can make can be incredibly strong. So one really simple and trivial example is just this idea of homophily. People hang out with people who are like them and who are interested in the things they do. They're all interested in. It's really hard if all of your friends support, I'm in the UK, so I'm using a soccer example, support Arsenal and you support Chelsea. Life on a Saturday afternoon with your mates isn't that fun. And so we naturally move towards a kind of realm of homophily because it's quite easy. And cognitively and emotionally, it's really difficult to spend a lot of time doing things that you're not interested in and you don't like, right? I mean, if you don't like young adult detective fiction, right? Go off and read 60 of those books in a row and nothing else, and then tell me how you feel after that, right?
Not great.
Not great. So homophily is again another sort of human trait that is incredibly, so it seems to be sort of deeply embedded in us psychologically, and it's a sociological function that is so much easier to do. That sorting hat is much easier to do in a digital Facebook platform than it is in the real world. Now, it does happen in the real world, right? Through mechanisms of, sort of where do people of different races and socioeconomic backgrounds kind of end up living in cities, and how does that get triggered? And, even before you have sorts of explicit racist policies, this filtering starts to happen. So we do it anyway, but it's just that it's done at a much faster and less explicit rate on these platforms. So I think that would have contributed to some degree of political polarization. I say contributed because we need to see what the data actually says, and we need to see what is anecdotal versus what is actually statistical, and we need to see what is what emerged versus what was really done actively. So, for example, I think we know, and Facebook admits, that when you look at the Rohingyas and the way in which the Myanmar authorities kind of constructed sort of hate towards them, or you look at various instances of racial hate that spread in India through WhatsApp, you can see that connection. I think you can see that the whole January the 6th thing relied quite a lot on these sort of digital networks and their ability to sort of connect people. So it looks pretty unhealthy. There's a mix of evidence that shows its degrees of unhealthiness that may be systemic, maybe not. But it is driven by fundamentally this issue that the technology got really powerful, and we didn't know what kind of capabilities we need internally to manage it as individuals, and we didn't know what we needed sort of from an institutional level that was kind of regulatory.
Yeah, it feels like what you're saying here is that in a lot of ways, as the exponential curve took off, it carried with it the extreme aspects of human behavior and amplified those in just a very powerful way. So while we think that a lot of this is, you could argue that technology is actually getting in there and making things worse, it's really just allowing the human condition to be expressed.
Well, but that may be making things worse.
Yeah, totally.
That literally might be the way in which the thing gets worse. And it, I think one of the things that was helpful is that it made explicit these types of relationships and assumptions. So one of the technologies that unfortunately I didn't talk about because I cut the chapter for reasons of length from the book was some work that was done in some of these early language models, the things that were sort of predating the transformer models like BERT and then GPT, which were called word vectors. And what you were able to do starting in about 2014, 2015, because of the computation being cheap enough, was look at the kind of whole of human corpuses of text, English, natural language, English text, and look at the relationships that were established within them. And in those relationships, you could kind of go off and say, man is to woman as, and it would say doctor is to nurse, as strong is to decorous. How it would construct these relationships and make them explicit, these sort of kind of fundamental biases. The great example is, if you asked an AI system, picture a president, an American president, it's only ever going to picture essentially a white guy, because even though the Constitution doesn't say that, and so what these technologies did was they actually rendered explicit a lot of things that were implicit. So that's definitely something that happened. But there's another thing that happened with the recommendation algorithms on places like YouTube and Facebook, which I think is different to this idea that it just showed the human condition up. And Zeynep Tufekci, who's a sociologist attached to one of the sort of storied Ivy League universities, talks about this quite well. It's sort of the extremification of content that you see that drags people into the flat earthing movement. And I had a really good example of that when I had some back issues early on in writing the book, and I went on YouTube to look for some yoga for backs, and I couldn't settle for the first one I was given, and I was like, I am not going to do this yoga until I find the perfect yoga. I mean, it was the most un-yogic thing to do. But of course, as you might imagine, not only did I sailed straight past yoga, straight into like extreme back strengthening. And so actually that's not unveiling the human condition. What that's doing is it's actually kind of conditioning me in a really, really negative way, out to the extremes. And again, a lot of people have talked about and I have identified this, and there have been whistleblowers from these firms to say, yeah, that's what we knew this thing was actually doing. And so I think that we can't. There was explicit design in these systems, and there was explicit awareness of what the risks would be, but it was too much hassle to have the conversation with civil society early on. And that's what happened, I think.
So rather than just revealing our demons so that we could work on them, it fed our demons so that they became stronger, in a sense. Does that make sense?
I don't think anyone is born a flat earther.
Right.
I don't think anyone believes that. Anyone is born believing that COVID is zapped in via 5G and nanobots that Bill Gates controls. I mean, this stuff is completely insane. Right. I don't think, and even... we know about media manipulation and narrative manipulation, and the ability to get people to sort of believe sort of absurd or extreme things. It's been the it's been the sort of key strength of many a totalitarian for a really, really long period of time. But it's just that it can be done at this big scale. And I think what was a bit unseemly in the process was the extent to which the denials came from the platforms that this was actually happening, that they and the notion that you could have a little fix on that could just be bolted on the side, like community health, and you'd see it because over the years since they've had an advertising platform for several years, I used to advertise on Facebook, and if you put something in and it passed their automated test, human review would come in and tell you that was unacceptable within seconds, because Procter and Gamble and the Toyota account were too important, right, to spoil, and it was never done on the kind of content itself, or on the design, not even the content, forget that, on the design of the systems by which we put content out, and I think that's where I slightly disagree with someone brilliant like Eric Schmidt, who was the chairman of Google for many years, who says technology is fundamentally neutral. I don't think it's fundamentally neutral. There are certain patterns in technology, the learning pattern that we talked at the beginning, that is happening sort of almost independently. But technology isn't neutral. It's always shaped and designed and fashioned by people.
So that brings us, I feel like, to the inevitable question of policies and regulation. How do you approach this very challenging topic of kind of controlling and, I guess, reining in this beast that seems to be running amok?
Well, I went through a journey in researching and writing the book, starting from a point thinking that it's sort of on the technologists a little bit, and the fact that they're not necessarily, uniformly charming characters doesn't help, and some are certainly more charming than others. I think Sundar Pichai and Satya Nadella, Tim Cook, these are characters with a certain amount of charm. But as I went through the work, I started to think that that it's actually as much about that lower linear line, asking the right questions and engaging appropriately, and starting to understand what's deliberate, what's accident, what's design, what emerges from the nature of the technologies themselves. One good example of this is this notion of planned obsolescence that goes around, that companies deliberately build their products for sort of end of lifing, so that you buy an upgrade. And there are two things about that. Number one, especially with products with lithium-ion batteries, they only have a certain amount of charge cycles in them, and that's the chemistry of it. And below the chemistry is the mother of all sciences, is the physics of it. And so that's just an absurdity. And the second is, as a kid who still has, I'm going to hold up my first computer, the ZX81 Spectrum, ZX81
Nice.
from Sinclair, 1K of RAM. This thing still works, but I can't do anything with it. And it's not because the developers are evil. It's just that our expectations and demands change. And the technology doesn't stand still. And so one of the things, just to look at those two issues, is there's nothing that prevents a liberal arts graduate complaining about planned obsolescence to go off and invent a battery that lasts 1 billion charge cycles. Go off and do it. I mean, nothing is going to stop you doing it. And the second is that it's really hard to say to people, you should freeze your technology at a certain point, and say that to an ecosystem of free individuals and companies that have rights to just behave in particular ways. And when you think about the people who sometimes say that, and you look at them and you say to them, have you ever discovered a shortcut on your way to work? Do you take that shortcut? Well, you've just gone off and done learning.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's this inherently human thing. So I changed my view, and that's not to say, like Silicon Valley libertarian style, there should be no regulation, everything should just do what it does, and let's get better for it. It's to say that actually there needs to be this really, really sensible dialogue, and that actually involves, to be honest, both sides leveling up. But the institutional side, which actually has the force of the state behind it, needs to level up faster to have better conversations. Now, it's not helped when you have really ideological, politically skewed people often running these companies who've read a couple of Cliff's Notes on Ayn Rand and Milton Friedman, and are willing to sort of opine thereafter. And even those who've read a lot of it and are experts and scholars in their own right, for them not to recognize that it's kind of an ideology which has to compete with others, and we should actually have that dialogue, I think is unhelpful. So, my sense now is you're either going to be a maker or a taker in this space. If you want to be a maker, then you need to level up in both directions. But my emphasis started to change when I started to realize that actually it's really as much about regulators and business leaders and ordinary folk outside of the tech industry to start to understand how products come to be, how learning happens, how these second and third order effects happen. But it's a really, really difficult issue for which, I don't have any easy answer.
Yeah. Well, in that sense, as we kind of come to the end of our time here, I just want to get the future oriented perspective from you. Are you optimistic about the direction we're going? Are you pessimistic? How do you think things are playing out in terms of assuaging or reconciling this chasm or this divide that's forming between the technology and society? Do you feel like we might be able to actually close the gap, or do you just see an ever widening future?
I think it's a really it's a complex pattern which plays out differently in different parts of the world. So India, for example, has had this really worrying turn away from democracy and towards a sort of real thuggish, racially motivated, populism, and yet their smartphones are getting more and more powerful. So I am optimistic about the fact that the technologies will continue to deliver capabilities that we can apply wisely or less wisely. And certainly the ability to have clean non-carbon energy is just an incredible bonus. but we will have some institutional choices about the way in which we want these things to sort of manifest themselves, and that's really about power, and power being the ability to get people to do things they don't know they want to do, or don't want to do explicitly, and that is where I think the politics starts to play a role. So a large part of the Web3 movement is this idea that there should be new gatekeepers to digital platforms. It shouldn't just be a handful of very large companies. It should be a lot of pseudo user owned services, but in reality they just have their own internal power structure. And that's a discussion. There's a discussion about what should be provided as a public good or a commons, versus things that are provided purely for profit. So in other words, should there be many other things that look like Wikipedia, or should everything look like I'm trying to think of an example, but Facebook, or the old CompuServe where you were charged by the minute. And I think that those are really important questions of choice that talk to how we then close the exponential gap. And I think it's really hard to know, because it's a very complex environment. So for all of the sort of angst that the right feels about government involvement in the economy or in the world at all, the right wing, both in the US and in the UK, has embraced government intervention in the supply of critical minerals for exponential technologies like molybdenum and rare earths and cobalt and so on, right? Because they've realized that the market on its own is not going to deliver that. And so there is also this sense that actually there is a bit of a consensus, even if people's ideas don't necessarily agree with them, around things that must be done. And I think it's important to start with points of points of agreement as we move forward. I'm not a politics person, so I don't have to get into that messy fight. But the technology creates opportunities, and I hope that partly through generational shift, partly through books like mine, more people have the tools to ask the right questions, or shape things in ways that are more broadly beneficial.
Yeah, I'll always support using wisdom as the guiding focus through life. Azeem, we're coming up on time, so I want to respect yours, but I want to give you a chance to kind of lay out any stuff that you'd like to talk about, anything you'd like to let people know that you're working on. I believe the book comes out in paperback in March of next year.
In paperback in March in the US, and it's
US.
out in paperback in other parts of the world now. I mean, I think finishing thoughts really are that we're on the second half of that curve. We're past that inflection point now, and we went through that in that period by I think sort of 2013 to 2017 sort of period, but we're really distinctly past it, and actually a lot of the choices that we have as individuals are really now live in that space, because you can go off and buy an electric vehicle now, right? You can go off and do it. There's no question it's not going to be the platform of the future. And so I would just sort of encourage people to, it's a chance to go back and revisit your priors, because as exponential processes go, they start off very boring. And as the king learnt on the chessboard, there's a turning point where suddenly things get out of control. And I think we're about there now.
Fair enough, man. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time, Azeem, and thank you for all your wisdom.
Thanks so much. Cheers.